Hello, hello, sweet babies, sweet darlings. This is John Edward Willey, and this is Circle 8, and I'm praying that you can hear me. The wind is a-blowing, it's blowing hard, but luckily I have a booming bass voice that I hope is coming through live and direct from Midtown, Kansas City, a middle-aged man transversing the middle of a town, discussing everything that comes in the middle between theory and life, between literature and philosophy, between thinking and actuality. I'm here to talk to you about the waking mess. What is the waking mess? Well, I'd like to think that the meaning of it is in the title. The Waking Mess is a podcast about philosophy and life. And I emphasize the and part. There's a lot of podcasts that are about philosophy and obviously a lot of podcasts about life. But what I'm most interested in is the connection between the two. And so I conceive of philosophy as living in dialectical relationship to lived experience. I think that what we are doing when we philosophize is in many respects testing or auditing or exploring or experimenting with underlying ideas. And I think that the fruit, the value that comes in philosophy comes precisely out of this relationship between ideas and the ways in which we test ideas, as I say, because I'm on that Nietzschean angle where I'm coming from a Nietzschean angle where one is not merely thinking ideas, but also living through ideas. In other words, this is sort of critical of the general liberal notion that thinking itself in its most profound form or most applicable form is somehow divorced from life. You know, and so it's no wonder that philosophy is taught, as I see it, as in colleges, as being a museum-styled enterprise. In other words, they sort of think of philosophy as having happened out there, and it's contained in text. And I revere the Western tradition, the Western canon, all of the great texts. But I think there's a sense in which we betray the underlying urgency, the existential capacity that philosophy has to not get us to change our life. It's not about a transcendental experience, but it's more real than that, because what you experience is an underlying sort of auditing and edification of your interior life, as well as a developed capacity to speak truth to power out there. That all comes along with developing the ability to spot underlying tacit presuppositions, or to see that there are mythological or archetypal structures orienting and grounding everybody's thinking without their self-awareness. In other words, people believe things they don't even know they believe, and in philosophizing you tend to discover that. And in case you didn't know, it also has to do with yourself. So speaking truth to power in philosophy isn't merely speaking truth to power out there, because there's power within us. And that's my sort of anarchist angle. You know, there's a sense in which we ourselves are creating and recreating, reconstituting these relationships of power. So philosophy in its deconstructive mode is one that wants to undo these political angles. It wants to undo these inherent assumptions and beliefs that we tend to have about ourselves and other people that are really destructive. Not only that are they destructive to other people and ourselves, but it's destructive to the world, not because it's a moral thing, but because if one has an inherent desire to recover and reclaim your experience, to take back your life, you have to be willing to deconstruct things that are already dead within you. That is, to let go of the ghost, to let go of what is superstition to you. And so I think of all of that as having to do with what philosophy is in its fullest sense, but it's always operating in conjunction with these great books from the past. Mainly philosophical books, and I understand that it seems absurd and stupid to study something like Plato or Aristotle or Kant or David Hume or Spinoza, because it seems to have no relationship to our lives. But that's something that I'm here to challenge. That's an idea that I'm here to confront and deconstruct, because I think that it has a very, albeit indirect, it's not a systematic or a principle-based orientation, but there's a sense in which the self-examined life leads to discoveries and surprises that almost transcend philosophy itself, because the kind of discoveries that you make about life and about reality and about society, it ultimately is something that you can't really replace with any other kind of experience, because it's sort of the reconstitution of experience itself. In that if you admit on a certain level that language or thinking at least changes the way that we experience reality. So it's not that you are tapping into the matrix or anything like that, but what you in philosophy discover is that there are things that are making you what you are in many different ways that have to do with language and ideas and reasoning, but it also has to do with the very images that you have of yourself. And it's in the sort of almost like the joyful destruction of those idols and ideals that one sort of discovers that there's something else that's being born within it. And so I don't mean to emphasize one side or the other, but I have to, like, in many respects, pay attention to the dichotomy, to the difference between philosophy and life. Because I'm already hyper speculative, metaphysical as they come. I'm sort of what they call a closeted intellectual, in the sense that I've always practiced philosophy on my own by myself, and out of respect for others, but also out of decency towards myself, I don't really bring up philosophical things with other people. It's not because out of weakness or anything, it's just that my modus operandi is to go within myself and do my work within myself. And so when I hear something fascinating or interesting or challenging, which is ideal, you want to hear challenging things, my first instinct is to go away and think about it very deeply and decide what I think. But it's also because you want to hold on to what is most precious with other people, and that has nothing to do with argumentation. I mean, there's a sense in which argument in the political sphere is completely relevant and important and necessary, but there's the experience that we all have where something seems to be getting in our own way. And I suspect that in many ways that's because of our inability to recognize these dichotomies. There's a time for thinking and there's a time for living. Now, there's no manual, there's no blueprint that comes with it. So that's why, in another Nietzschean sense that I'd mentioned before in regards to Nietzsche, that ideas are not separate from reality, that we're living out and testing ideas in the way that we live, and we're challenging ideas in the way that we live. There's another Nietzschean sense that what we're ultimately doing is without organization, without principle, because it ultimately has to do with the frenzy of an actual animal, an actual brain, living in relation with a larger reality. And so that Nietzschean instinct in me allows me to relax enough to see that there's something inherently experimental and free-floating about thinking, about all thinking, and what it is that we're doing when we think. And so the desire that I find to be the second thing about what Nietzsche is, that makes him crucial in terms of not telling us what to think, but sort of offering us a toolkit, a methodology for learning how to think better in terms of relating philosophy to life. The thing that Nietzsche brings up in many different ways has two different kinds of metaphors. One is dancing and the other is swimming. There's a sense in which, I gotta quit saying that there's a sense in which, I know that that's obnoxious and repetitive, but Nietzsche's notion that because principles and logic with a capital L are not discovered, one can only dance. That is something that you learn over time in many different ways. I once had a boss that told me in regards to a job that I had that it was like being a chef with having spinning plates. When you're a chef, you have many different things going at once. And so I think that there's a way in which one is dancing with these various elements, with these various dimensions of what a philosophical life is. Because what we're doing is pursuing the examined life, the self-examined life. The examined life is not worth living. The examined life is not worth living. When I began my philosophical exploration a long time ago, that kind of paralyzed me because I didn't know how to make sense of that. Like, what did that mean? But that's what I'm here to describe as being the most wonderful way to make your life better, is to pursue the examined life. It's also, I should say, the most painful way to live, You know, there's something that is inherently difficult and arduous and overwhelming, and it can feel like it's destroying who you are within, that that you're letting go of something that you can't live without. And so there's an old idea that I'm not a big fan of romanticism or romantic philosophers, but one of them had said that joy and pleasure are so connected to one another that you can't have the greatest joys in life without also experiencing the greatest pain. We have a tendency to want to separate pain and pleasure, but we find that the cheap, superficial pleasures that we get easily don't really fill us up with anything like meaning, because it's only in experiencing difficulties, experiencing pain, not in a self-flagellating or masochistic way, but recognizing that greatness is what elicits a particular kind of, I don't know, a sort of jouissance, as the French say, a sort of experience of exaltation. And I've rarely experienced that, but when I have, it's been in relationship to my willingness to endure the meticulous qualifications of living. That's a really stupid thing to say, what I just said. What I mean to say is that it's not about physical pain, but about seeing that in order to experience life really deeply, this is the part of my pitch, you have to read literature, and you have to read poems, and you have to look at great art, great paintings, you have to watch great movies, you have to learn how to listen to great music, classical, contemporary, all of it. But I emphasize the active element of learning how to see a painting. Once you learn how to read a painting in the way that anyone really can, or if you learn how to draw in the most basic sense of connecting your eye to the world and using a pen or a pencil, you're actually activating this capacity for deep pleasure. You know, deep pleasure. That's why deep learning, or deep education, as they call it, or as I call it, deep education, is connected to the deepest pleasures. And so it seems painful to learn how to play the piano. I can't play, but I know it does seem difficult. But I'm drawn to the idea that it would be an absolutely amazing experience to even play a few tunes. So I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but to say that even philosophy's difficulty is extremely pleasurable, but its difficulty goes outside of ideas. It's not just about thinking, it's about beginning with the seeing that we are living out our ideas. Or at least, I mean, ideally, the ideal rational agent is living out their ideas or thinking rationally, so that we'll put that aside. But we're going to begin with a sense that to philosophize, to live deeply, to live richly, to live a qualitatively expansive life also means to experience discomfort. It means to experience the vertigo, you know, the vertigo that comes with uncertainty, with seeing that the big narratives that we have don't really explain anything, and that the stories we have don't really tell us much. And that doesn't mean that there's not truth out there. It doesn't mean that at all. It doesn't mean that there aren't other people out there who know a lot and can't help you. But it also means that you have to put the pieces together on your own. And that's why I'm of the belief that philosophy is only halfway deconstructive or analytical. I experience philosophy as something that isn't just taking apart ideas, but putting them together synoptically. Synoptical is a word that other people use, and I think it's very helpful for thinking in terms of synapses, or thinking in terms of the relational quality between ideas, that on a certain level, when I think of myself as being sort of almost like a musician who's playing with ideas and connecting ideas and notions and questions and books and figures from past history and moments in time. All of that is stitched into the tapestry that thinking becomes when you're practicing the second side of what philosophy is, which is the synoptical. It could be called holistic with an H, but also it's holistic with a W, because it's about being a whole human being. What does it mean to be a whole human being? That's a critical question. So all of this, my friends, my babies, my sweet darlings, All of this is a preface, a prelude to my discussion. What is the waking mess? You know, I've hinted at the relation of dichotomies, right? And that waking and the mess are related. And that's because I think of philosophy as an inherently failing. And not that it fails and it's pointless, but that there's sort of a horizon within every philosophical life. And that horizon sort of happens on a daily basis. Like you wake up, you think, and hopefully you go to sleep. Hopefully you're not so hyped up on amphetamines that you never sleep. But at a certain point you're able to practice the kind of balancing act that philosophizing requires. It doesn't mean that one turns their mind on like a light bulb, but that all ideas ultimately deconstruct. And I'm a big believer in ideas and rationality and thinking clearly, but all notions end on a certain level. And what I mean by that is that you wake up the next day and you have to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. That is the mess. And I want to create a podcast that fosters that without turning away. A podcast that fosters this thing within philosophy that is musical, but also rational, that's like a dance between theory and life, and that wants to recognize that everything has an aphoretic inherent instability. Or, you know, there's antinomies in the sense that there's ideas that are equally rational and therefore equally unbelievable. And since all of this goes everywhere at once, because philosophy is always happening at once. The past in philosophy is happening in the present. And so I want to hold on to that and hold on to the spontaneous, vulnerable thing that one has to practice when one is philosophizing out loud. I'm trying to stop this wind from whipping my hat off. And so I'm bringing up the fact that I can say everything at once. I can't say everything at once, but that I have to speak in a simpler form. Meaning that I have to speak about the waking mess in a almost cartoonish way, right? And that's how I'm going to speak about it, my friends. We're going to bring philosophy back down to earth. Bring philosophy into life. We're going to think about our experiences in life, the everyday experiences you have of going to sleep, of eating, falling in love, dying, how all of this comes with a kind of ephemeral, glittering thing, which is speculative thought, the life of the mind. You want to ask questions because reality seems to be questioning itself. At least for me, since a young age, philosophy has been emerging from my experience. I had philosophical problems as a child. I have them now. It's a certain group of people. It's not something that you really learn, but it's something that some people have because they ask questions, because things maybe point in a way that is confusing to someone wanting to make sense or wanting to unify their understanding, or who are wanting to think beyond experience and make sense of not just questions, but understandings and ideas that seem to point in many ways at experience and beyond experience. In the waking mess, we're going to look at one question per episode. At least that's how I'm going to organize the first 12 or so episodes. Each one is going to investigate a philosophical question. So after the first introductory episodes, I'm going to begin a series of episodes about what are called epistemological problems. And epistemology in philosophy simply means the question of how we know what we know and what we can know. In other words, what is knowledge? What constitutes knowledge? And within that, I mean, to make it easier, epistemology has to do with questions that we sort of heard at one point or another in our life. Maybe there are questions that emerged when we had a few drinks at a party, or questions that emerged in an argument with other people whenever you were thinking about abstract things, or it could be something that comes from a crisis in your life or a really big experience. I mean, great experiences that are joyful can elicit philosophical questions as much as tragedies can. And so the questions in epistemology are, what is truth? What is truth? And so if you focus on that question for one episode, I think that you can bring together a lot. Another question is, what is skepticism? That sounds strange, but it has to do with our ability to ask questions in different ways, or to be skeptical. There's a history of it, but there's also a way in which it makes sense in our lives. And making sense of it in a way that puts it in its right place is critical to grasping the question of questions regarding skepticism. And that itself goes within the epistemological questions. Another one in this series is, what is belief? What does it mean to have a justified belief? That's a part of the question of truth, but it also relates to the question of what is knowledge, right? Where does knowledge come from? We're sort of rarely asking this question, but there's different traditions and they all work together in the world that we inhabit. Different traditions come together, but they contain contradictions, because there's certain groups of people who believe that all knowledge only comes from experience, from our personal experience, or from propositions that have been verified by science. And then there are people who believe that through rationality or through some kind of transcendent maneuver or some kind of thought, that you can have experience that isn't personal, that is something that is universal. And that is something in the work of Descartes, and the former one I was talking about happens in the work of David Hume. And so that's just one example of how a podcast might open up that question. And like I said at the intro, it would open up these questions, but we're reading them in the book of life. You know, it's not about our personal experiences or anything like that. It's really about seeing that we are philosophizing ourselves. Like, we're not just paying reverence to philosophy. We're not just paying tribute to it. We're doing it. And so that involves discovery, that involves argument, that involves slowing down, stepping back. Almost like it's a game of chutes and ladders. You know that old board game, Chutes and Ladders? There's something like that in philosophy. And so you might wonder, why philosophize? What's the point? That's a very common kind of response. And I think that it's either obvious to some people or it's not, right? I'd mentioned earlier that I have philosophical problems. So to me, philosophy is inherently interesting. Like, there's an inherent joy and power and all kinds of other things that come along with it, even if you realize that it's not what you thought it was, that it's not the same kind of project that you thought it was. You find that it's absolutely exhilarating nonetheless. Now, on the other hand, philosophy really has to do with recognizing that our thinking, no matter what it is structured by language and ideas. You could call them a lot of things, like paradigms or meta-narratives or, techne. And what it really means is that socially, there's often little evidence or little rationality to believe in things. And so that's what you might discover in philosophy. But more than that, you discover that underneath that, or above that, within yourself and within other people, there are a number of things that, like I mentioned earlier, are sort of ideas that are beneath your ideas, because they're at the basis of your ideas, because we are always burying, in many ways, because we have brains and because we are what we are, we're always ignoring, not paying attention to the knowledge that we inherit. And so one might be learning how to disconnect oneself from that in lieu of practicing this philosophical process that helps you let go of, to dislodge, to break away from these ideas that are not real. And what I mean by burying is that to be human means to be haunted by or driven by a ghost or demons. And I don't mean metaphysically, but what I mean is that thinking itself, in my own imaginative way, thinking itself is constituted by sort of ghosts, demons, angels, meaning that we're always, in being human, wrestling with the past. We're wrestling with what we've done. We're always working and sort of haunted by other ideas and notions. And I think that a lot of what philosophical practice is means that one has to be a sort of dragon slayer. Like, you got to be a dragon slayer. So that's my definition of philosophy. Now, I have a very, since I have philosophically have a certain idea about human nature, I have a philosophical idea about human nature. That means I have an idea about philosophy that comes from my idea about human nature. Now, it sounds like a kind of loop. It sounds like a hermeneutic twist, but it's not. It's sort of a deep recognition that there is, in fact, so much more that's going on, and that when you are taking apart ideas and letting go and deconstructing, you're sort of opening up your vision of the world, opening up to a deeper expanse. And so the reason that I'm talking about human nature, the reason that I was just talking about my belief about human nature, it means that I don't really expect myself to think beyond myself, because I can begin with seeing that I'm not what most people think the human being is. I'm not what we think we are. And so to practice philosophy means to operate within this understanding that what we're doing when we're taking apart ideas is kind of meaningless. It's almost like a frenzy, like a dog in a house that's tearing things apart. There's a very bleak, depressing sense, if you've gone to graduate school or studied philosophy, that it is pointless or that it is meaningless. And I suppose, but just like you might challenge your ideas about human nature to include that you wouldn't include, you might also change your ideas about what significance is. Because see, these loops, these things that keep us locked into ideas that make reality and reality make ideas, these loops are precisely what are unthreaded by philosophy. I know this sounds crazy, but if you challenge your ideas about what it means to be human, you might experience reality in a way that's more human. And I'll leave that there, because the question of significance is also related. Where is meaning at? I might have an episode in The Waking Mess on the meaning of life. Where is meaning at? And it sort of is an episode that has to happen in relationship to the question of whether or not God exists. I think that's a very helpful and a very surprising kind of question, because it leads in directions that you might not expect it to. But the question of meaning is something that in philosophy is almost too abstract. I mean, I've always, when I studied philosophy, been interested in the meaning of life, but that's a question that philosophy almost can't address, right? It has to do with experience. Meaning has to do with the significance of experience. And that's related to pursuing great art as in lieu of wanting to have great experiences that might be difficult. But it has to do with something even more fundamental, which is seeing that the meaning of life is in life itself. And that's a philosophical proposition, but it's also clear to those that are sort of radiating with life. And what it means is that philosophically, you can believe that things mean something because something else gives them meaning, or that it comes from the outside world, so that if God doesn't exist, life itself has no meaning. But there's an opposite, almost opposite kind of point of view, which is that things are significant in themselves. In philosophy, this is seen as anti-teleology, non-teleology. But even that, like I said, sort of denudes or betrays the quality that we're getting at, which is the quality of experience, the quality of significance. And I think when we are experiencing art, you know, a lot of people, like where I live, don't experience art. I think like a TV commercial, and I don't mean this to put them down, but a TV commercial is like all they have time for. Like that's like Americans in relation to art. And I think there's something incredibly beautiful, actually. There's a sublimity to TV commercials. But I use it as a model for watching movies, for reading great poems. And what I mean is that when you see that what a person is doing, no matter who they are, what happens to the ontology of the person in the act of participating with an artistic medium like poetry or a TV commercial or whatever, is that their self-awareness is softened, or it's softened already. Like the hyper reflexivity that we tend to have, the hyper self-awareness, it's not that disappears, you know, it's not that thinking goes away. But what actually happens is that there's a qualitatively different experience, and it's earned by the person who learns how to look closely. And of course, with TV commercials, you don't have to learn anything. Like the grammar of our perception is structured by our consumer relation to TV media. And so that's sort of given to us. But even movies, you have to learn how to watch movies and learn how to pay attention to different things that deeply reward your attention. But what is it that happens in the experience of listening to really great music? Right? What is the quality of great music that we love? Or I love music, but it could be a lot of things that soften self-awareness. And how does it relate to the crude, inhuman ways that we tend to teach art and literature as being something that is like, it's almost like having a job. It's almost like there's not supposed to be pleasure. It's almost like taking apart the text has to do with some goodie that's like coming later. You know, that just seems so absurd. And so I tie that into the relation between pleasure as being something one privileges and the most significant acts of life. You know, pleasure is the basis of all of this. And so significance is a pleasurable resonance, and it's sort of like a tuning rod. And life in itself outside of art is meaningful in itself. And that meaning isn't a thought or an idea. That sense of meaning, that sense of exhilaration, has everything to do with a change in your state of mind. It has everything to do with a shift in your attitude. And I really believe that shift in attitude is sometimes the work of philosophy, like philosophical speculation and questioning. I think it can nudge a person in such a way that they might begin seeing and feeling this meaning in life. I hope to make it a part of the waking mess. The waking mess is wanting to open up the significance of philosophical speculation as having something to do with the musical nature of life. And I want to make philosophy musical. In fact, you know, I see myself as sort of like a mix master or a DJ in the world of ideas. That's at the heart of Circle 8, is that I'm the mix master here, you know, and not all of these ideas are mine. How could they be? But I have developed an original relation between all of these ideas. I'm playing synoptically in the way that, you know, maybe particular DJs do when they're not just mixing tracks, but they're mixing within the tracks. Like, it's not just about taking samples and artificially putting them together. Like, a great DJ is creating like an experience, right? And so in Circle 8, I'm creating an experience that's cognitive and imaginative. And so I'm trying to like shape a world for you. And the way that I want to keep it simple, the thing that I want to mention as sort of a passing reflection, a last thought, has to do with not only is each episode going to be a exploration of a fundamental philosophical question, we're also going to focus on, as I said, the relationship between these questions in life. So it's not really going to be scholarly or pedantic or anything like that. It'll have to be spontaneous and off the cuff, because not only is it about philosophy and life, but like I mentioned, it's about performative philosophy. Like, philosophy is a performative discipline, and that means that philosophy is a process. And the philosophers Plato and Wittgenstein, thousands of years apart, are both exemplary in this practice. And so I see it as something that we're doing, but it also makes everything that I'm saying kind of vulnerable, like experimental, so it could always go awry, like it does in most of these videos. But I think that by having a starting point and having sort of some organizing principles, I can ensure that it won't get too lost, that each episode won't get too chaotic. So I think that these questions are great for simplifying the pursuit, but I also think that we're going to explore fundamental text. Like, I really believe in the great tradition, the classical tradition, and that means reading books closely. We're gonna practice a particular kind of close reading. So we're gonna look at individual passages from all kinds of different philosophers, and we're gonna think openly and intensely about those particular passages. And we're also going to be connecting it to pop culture and to anything that comes into our minds. That has to be said, because we're doing the superficial and the deep, the waking and the mass. It's all going to happen at once. But like I said, it's going to be a focus on close reading. So basic questions like about philosophy. I've only discussed epistemology, but I have a lot of metaphysical and ontological, ethical, and political questions. It's going to deal with all of that, but it's going to try to like keep it simple so that each episode is looking at a basic text, a basic passage that's looking at a basic question. I know that sounds too complicated, but in fact it is. I hope at least it sounds as simple as it is to me. And what I mean by close reading is that passages, like we're going to look at passages and see how reading a single passage, reading a single paragraph can take 3 or 4 hours. And what that means is that there's a deep richness. Like, that's one thing that I really believe in, is that there's a deep richness that's just waiting for us in books and in great books and great ideas. And like I said, I'm synoptical, so we're reading these all in relation together, and we're reading them in terms of life. So it's not merely an abstract thing, because the other questions that orient us are questions about how to live. That's the other thing that's going on. The questions of how to live that I suggested earlier are strangely, seemingly outside of philosophy for good reason. And so the question that comes through in Socrates and Montaigne and others is the question of, how do I live my life? And the thing that I want to connect all of that to, like, if it's about philosophy and life, right? By life, I do mean everyday life and pop culture. I love pop music and advertising, TV commercials. I want to talk about all that stuff, comic books and movies. But also, honestly, I've always loved philosophy, but I've always loved poetry. Like, since I was 19, poetry and philosophy have been my true ruling passions. And so whenever I talk about life, I'm talking about literature. So philosophy and literature are what come together in this. And literature is my guiding principle. Like, if I have anything like a gospel, it's the literary gospel. And I don't mean merely the great books, but I mean reading for pleasure, reading your own favorite great books. And I think that that's what life is. Life is represented in great literature and great poetry. So besides closely reading philosophical passages, I want to read poetic passages in connection, because this existential anecdotal material is what is really left out of philosophy. Philosophy is way too abstract, and you can tell by most philosophy courses and lectures and introductory textbooks, all of it, that they've really run out of material, because they're operating as if we didn't have questions ourselves. And so although I'm starting out really simply and discussing very traditional kinds of questions, I'm ultimately wanting to explore very particular, very unique kinds of questions about philosophy. And I think that these questions go in a lot of different directions. And that's why after I do these first 12 episodes, I might shift gears and start focusing on something else. We do find that that I tend to speak in hyperbolic gestures and speak a lot. So I have a suspicion that a lot of these episodes will go in directions that I really can't predict. And so that's what I mean by it being a performative thing. I almost see it like music, because we're wanting to bring together an experience for the listeners that shows them, it doesn't talk about it, but it shows them what philosophy is. Philosophy and life. And there's a mnemonic impulse in me to think in terms of great questions, great books, and then to examine the ways in which it falls apart before our eyes. All of our ideas and theories collapse, but to celebrate that as being almost like a musical activity in itself is beautiful. But there's one thing that I have left out, one crucial, critical thing, which is that philosophy does matter. I think I would be upset if I did not say that in this episode, which is that I'm in the habit of downplaying philosophy. Like, I'm in the habit of suggesting that it's a musical, meaningless, speculative activity that is fun for some people. And I understand if you're not philosophical, right? I get it. I understand that it doesn't have any meaning to you. But the other part of the gospel is that, and what I'm here to tell you is that philosophy does matter. And it seems innocuous, it seems stupid, and fuck philosophers and colleges for betraying this. But philosophy can actually save your life. I don't think politics can save your life. I'm not even sure ethics exist. I don't think art saves life. But I do think that philosophical distinctions can save your life. In other words, knowing how to tell the difference between shit and shinola, knowing how to tell the difference between bullshit and wisdom, knowing how to pursue wisdom, how to see that being on the path to truth is not only fun, even if you never have truth with a capital T, being on that path to truth is meaningful, because it precisely means thinking clearly about our lives and developing the kind of understanding and ultimately the kind of experience that is so vital, insofar as it means, if anything means anything, then surely wisdom means something. You know, it's the old Talmudic question, where shall wisdom be found? And I think that question has manifold ways in which it unfolds. And philosophy is philosophy. It's the love of wisdom. And so, what is love? You know, that's a question that is largely outside of the periphery of philosophy, kind of like sex and desire and everything else that I'd mentioned earlier as being suspiciously outside of philosophy. And yet, the question of love, in fact, has profound meaning. And if it doesn't mean anything, then how can philosophy mean anything, right? If philosophy is the love of wisdom. So these are thoughts about The Waking Mess, a podcast about philosophy and life that I am working hard to bring into reality. And if you have anything to say about this, please let me know. I am John Edward Willie, and this is Circle 8. I love you guys.